Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, it's a brand new day for Tom Holland's Spider-Man as he goes up against a mysterious foe. Peter Parker, played by Tom Holland, has been on his own since the fateful spell that erased everyone's memory of him, pining from afar for MJ and Ned, played by Zendaya and Jacob Batalon. Peter has embraced the role of Spider-Man full-time, but his isolation takes its toll when his arachnid DNA starts to change, and it couldn't come at a worse time, as a mysterious foe who can jump from person to person attacks New York. Brand New Day marks the 7th film that Tom Holland has played Spider-Man in since he first joined the MCU in Captain America Civil War in a scene-stealing introduction. He was the 3rd actor to play Spidey in the span of 15 years, and the character and his world have dominated cinema screens in the last 10 years. You've got Holland in the Marvel films, you've got the animated Spider-Verse films that recently got a live-action spin-off with Spider-Noir, and you've got whatever bonkers thing Sony is doing to try and hold on to their film rights, a tactic that worked out well for Venom, but decidedly less so for Madam Web, Kraven the Hunter, and our dear sweet Morbius. At a time where there's endless discussion of superhero fatigue, clearly there is no sign of Spider-Man fatigue despite all this saturation. This latest film has had an enormous record-breaking opening, and I can personally tell you that my cinema was perhaps the busiest I've ever seen it on release day, selling out screening after screening. J. Jonah Jameson speaks for the audience when he says, "I want Spider-Man!" That being said, I have had mixed feelings about the way the character has been utilised in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, where you can clearly tell there was pressure to make a version that was noticeably different from the Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield versions. And I quite liked Homecoming, which had a youthful energy to it and serves as a reintroduction without having to do his origin story all over again. But the attachment of Tony Stark was something that started to take over the character, and by the time of Far From Home, which I really didn't like, he was more like Iron Man Jr. than Spider-Man. Part of the appeal of Peter Parker is that he's this down-on-his-luck New Yorker, and you miss a lot of that when you make him friends with a billionaire, give him loads of gadgets, and take him on a globe-trotting adventure and into outer space. And No Way Home felt like a response to some of those criticisms by heaping a load of nostalgia on top, by putting all 3 live-action Spider-Men together at once, as well as loads of the Rose Gallery from previous films. And it worked. It was a big improvement on its predecessor. But the ending definitely left things on an ambiguous note at the time as far as future films were concerned. Peter had to close the portal by effectively erasing himself, even from those he loved, and there was a question mark over whether that was the end of the story for Ned and MJ. Of course, we now know that it wasn't, but it turns out it was the end of the line for director John Watts, who helmed the Home trilogy, but decided not to return for the 4th film. Stepping into his place is destined Daniel Cretton, who started out making intimate character dramas like Short Term 12 and Just Mercy before changing course into the MCU, having some of the better received outings of a notably shaky period for Marvel, Shang-Chi and the TV series Wonder Man. So with a new director, the question is this a brand new day after all? Is it a soft reboot, or is it a continuation of what came before? Turns out the answer is a bit of both. Probably the most significant thing is that it does reset the character back to basics. Peter is downtrodden, but also much more grounded. He's also much closer to the traditional version of the character than he has been for a very long time, in that he's just your friendly neighbourhood Spider-Man than your intergalactic arachnid. It's also very apparent from the outset how different Cretton's approach to the character is to Watts, and the direction is much more visually dynamic than any of the previous Holland films, especially in the action sequences. He brings the same kind of fluidity from Shang-Chi into this, and we get much more high-speed web-slinging across New York, which is weirdly something that we haven't had a lot with in the MCU version. The opening of the film tries to make up for lost time with a montage of what Spidey's been up to since we last saw him, fighting against various enemies like Scorpion and the Hand, and gives us loads of that iconography in gorgeously framed shots that look like comic book splash splash pages. And what's especially striking and new is the shots between his mask and his face, or seeing Peter's eye through his Spider-Man mask, that firmly emphasise the film is interested in the man underneath the mask. It gives him a humanity underneath the superheroics, but so tight as to be claustrophobic and isolating. They're great. You can tell that Cretton has taken an enormous amount of influence from the hugely successful video games by Insomniac, even quoting them directly, and of course, the Sam Raimi films. There is a lot here that's directly inspired by the Maguire movies, and it is somewhat refreshing to actually embrace that, rather than just trying to be different for the sake of avoiding trying to follow in their footsteps. For example, as Peter's spider DNA starts to take over, he suddenly finds that he's developing his own organic web shooters out of his wrist, rather than the mechanical ones he invented. And organic web shooters was something that Raimi introduced that was quite divisive at the time, to the point where we even had a scene that was playfully ribbing that in No Way Home, and here we are full circle. There's also a scene involving a helicopter that I think might be a reference to the infamous World Trade Center teaser trailer for the original 2002 film that was pulled from circulation, because it does look strikingly similar. But the biggest Raimi influence is more in the way it handles the character generally, and how it's exploring that duality between Peter and Spider-Man. The idea of Peter's body turning against him is inspired by Spider-Man 2, where the stress of the job makes him turn his back on it, and he has these psychosomatic episodes where his powers fail him. Here, he's heading in the opposite direction. He's neglecting Peter Parker for the sake of Spider-Man, and it is starting to consume him. It's an obvious metaphor for the fact that his life is changing and that he's out of balance. He's losing control. In both movies, it stems from the fact that he's forcing himself to be secretive and reclusive to protect those that he loves. In Spider-Man 2, he couldn't admit his feelings for Mary Jane, and in Brand New Day, he can't bring himself to tell MJ and Ned who he is, even though he promised that he would at the end of No Way Home. He feels like he has to live with the burden of the truth by himself, that it's some noble sacrifice that he has to make to be the hero. It's an idea that's more relevant now than it was in 2004, when we're talking about the loneliness of young men, a lot of whom likely relate to Peter, and how that can curdle into something toxic and self-destructive, because no one is meant to go it alone. If anything, Peter is holding himself prisoner in a prolonged state of grief for the life that he once had. He spends his spare moments watching Ned and MJ's Instagram posts, watching their lives effectively continue without him, and it only causes him more pain. His distance isn't really to protect them, it's to protect himself from having to directly confront how things are now, however much that hurts. It probably shouldn't be, given how Crescent started his career, but there's a surprising amount of room for character drama, especially the relationship between Peter, Ned and MJ. Both seem to be drawn towards Spider-Man because they still have their connection to him, even though they have no memory of Peter. Nerdy Ned is especially fascinated in trying to work out who he is, even inventing a Spider-Man tracker app to try and find out where he is at any given moment. There's a subtle sense of absence in both their lives, even if they're not as acutely perceptive of it as Peter obviously is. The central trio have always had terrific chemistry together through the film's ups and downs, and the same is true here, and you can see how much they've grown as performers, especially Zendaya. Homecoming was her film debut, and now she's an established performer and a powerful emotional actor. Obviously, the off-screen romance and later marriage of Holland and Zendaya means there's a huge fan attachment for their on-screen relationship, but the pair are very vulnerable in this film, and it's genuinely poignant having spent so much time with these characters. The sparks between them are undeniable, but the dynamic is also different. Zendaya plays these quieter, more dramatic moments with real complexity and pathos, and they're genuinely powerful and authentic. She's very astute at tapping into the emotions of a scene, and in a big, bombastic superhero film, she's brilliantly subtle and understated. However, with all that being said, I don't think all of this is as effective as it was in Spider-Man 2, which is generally considered to be the best live-action film, although the 2002 film was actually my personal favourite. And I know that some of that is because that's a Spidey that I grew up with, and there's a whole generation now that knows Holland as their Spider-Man, but this isn't simply nostalgia talking. The first two Raimi films got so much right that they're hard to top. They're the blueprint now. The main issue that I have with Brand New Day is that it doesn't quite know what it wants to be. It felt torn whether it wants to be this smaller, more intimate story, but also trying to do the usual Marvel action and continuity building, and the result is the movie that feels like it's trying to be several films all at the same time. It's trying to deal with the ramifications of No Way Home, it's an exploration of loneliness, it's a buddy movie with John Bernthal's Frank Castle, and it's setting up a whole raft of important plot points for future films down the line. And for me personally, it made for a very weird viewing experience because it seemed to be a different film every 25 minutes or so, because it kept shifting what it wanted to focus on and what it seemed to be about. It has loads of ideas and directions, but hasn't knitted them together into a completely cohesive web. And don't get me wrong, there's a lot of things that I enjoyed in the moment as they were happening. A lot of the individual scenes work, but they feel strangely detached and isolated from each other in a way that feels weirdly messy in terms of themes and storytelling. Like, you have this stuff going on with MJ and Ned, but they have almost nothing to do with the actual forward plot of this body hopper. So yeah, MJ does get targeted at one point, so that kind of gives her a reason to have her involved in what's going on, but it's not really about her and what it's after. MJ and Ned are somehow both essential and peripheral simultaneously, and are both sidelined during the film's climax, where they only pop up briefly to add some kind of jeopardy and something for them to do, but they could have easily been left out of it completely, as that isn't their story. And then they keep adding characters and subplots on top of that, and it continues the issue with the Holland Spider-Man films of being overly cluttered. They can't just be Spider-Man films, they need to have everyone else in it, even when they aren't really necessary, and they just about pull that off in No Way Home, which was like a pizza with everything on it. So we have the return of Michael Mando's Scorpion, now actually in supervillain costume, who first appeared way back in Homecoming. Don't remember him? Well, he's back now, and he's pretty prominent, at least for having a physical villain in the film for Spidey to fight in the first half, after which the film completely drops him like a rock, never to be spoken of again. But the major thing the movie continues from the previous trilogy is that Spider-Man has to be teamed up with someone else in his own movie. We had Iron Man in Homecoming, Nick Fury, but not really, in Far From Home, and Doctor Strange in No Way Home. This time it's Bernthal's Punisher playing the sidekick. And don't get me wrong, a lot of this stuff is pretty entertaining in its own right. They make an amusing double act, not just because they've appeared together very recently in The Odyssey, but also all the way back in Pilgrimage. Fun fact, it was on the latter that Bernthal actually helped film Holland's audition for Spider-Man, so again, full circle. And Bernthal was good fun in this, getting to bring a lighter side to the brooding part he previously played on TV. Here, Bernthal's Frank Castle is a bit of a lunkhead who generally treats every situation that the bigger the problem, the bigger the gun, which is right a bit out of his depth here. Another MCU reprisal that I can actually talk about, as he's been in the trailers, is Mark Ruffalo's Bruce Banner, who is keeping his Hulk side in check with an inhibitor on his arm, and his role in this movie is to do exactly two things. A, set up where this character is going next, and B, have a big elaborate action scene with Spidey that is a highlight because the Hulk is as much an antagonist as he is a hero in his rage. Just ask Thor, or Iron Man. And on a thematic level, their inclusion makes sense. Spider-Man is wrestling against his own darker side that he wants to suppress. This growing arachnid side is making him lash out, and he wants to choose what kind of person he wants to be. And both Frank and Bruce are constantly battling against being the worst version of themselves, mirroring Peter's own struggles and urges. Frank in particular is something of a lost soul after his family's death. He's a loner that's turned to vigilantism and vengeance. Spider-Man is the closest person that he has to a friend, and Frank's a cautionary tale of where isolation gets you. He and Spidey are linked together by a Staten Island incident that the webslinger apparently saved his bacon on, and that loyalty offers Frank some way out of his darkness. And there is a scene where Frank breaks down over his loss to Peter, but the film doesn't make the most out of his and Bruce's connections to Peter and exploring that to enrich those themes. Again, it feels like the core plot could mostly function without them, or be replaced with someone else, as they drop in and drop out when the story needs them. They're both peripheral and essential simultaneously. There's also another guest star thrown in, and while their presence is always welcome and brings some funny moments playing off Holland, why do they need to be in this story? They're mostly here to enliven a talky exposition scene with a bit of star power distraction and link into the larger universe. And exposition is definitely an issue, especially in the first hour, where the scene that I've mentioned is directly followed by another scene of chunky expository dialogue. And I can't say I've seen a Spider-Man film before where he just sits down in an office in full costume to have a conversation, and frankly, I don't know if I want to see that again either. As much as this is something of a refresh, it continues to show that the weakest parts of these films, and many MCU films in recent years, is when they have to stop for the obligation of wider connectivity rather than the stories that they're trying to tell. That's why Spider-Man 2 does it better, because it has the time to drill down on Peter's drama rather than have it taken up by other stuff. A more personal, intimate Spider-Man film should have been allowed to just exist as that on its own terms, because that's where many of the best moments come from, and it would have been a better, more tightly focused film for it. And weirdly enough, Brand New Day does flirt with being a darker film, as there's a pinprick of horror in it, from Peter's transforming body to the film's main antagonist, who can jump from person to person with only Peter able to resist against them. In fact, that is literally the plot of a couple of horror films like The First Power or Denzel Washington's Fallen. There's something genuinely unsettling about someone who can take over people's autonomy at will and can be anyone, especially in the earlier portion where they're faceless, invisible, and everywhere all at once, and what they want isn't especially clear. There's a body-hopping chase across New York that's an exciting game of wits against a foe that may be too fast even for Spider-Man, and their tauntingly cavalier attitude about their power makes them seem unpredictable. And yet when we do learn who's behind it and why, it does take some of that creepiness away, even if it again echoes Peter's conflict with another character who has a dark side. And a part of that is because their motivation makes you wonder, if they have this ability, why don't they try to accomplish what they want by smarter, more subtle methods than causing as much destruction and attention to themselves as possible? On top of that, for all that's going on with the various plot turns and reveals, the film has one of the least surprising plot twists in some time. In fact, it's so blatantly obvious and barely concealed that I did wonder if it was even meant to be a twist at all, as I had a good idea of where the plot was going long before it got there. And the climax is also far too similar to the conclusion of an extremely recent MCU film that it was a bit distracting. It's not that it doesn't work, and it has a similar level of emotional punch, but also, didn't we just do this exact same scenario last year? I was getting deja vu, let alone those poor New Yorkers. I found Spider-Man Brand New Day to be oddly uneven and, like its hero, trying to do too much. It isn't because the individual pieces don't work, they're all entertaining at the time, they just don't always sit together easily as they compete for attention. I think the script needed a bit more work to stronger tie everything together as a whole, because it feels almost but not quite there. But the film mostly works because of the direction of Destin Daniel Cresson, who keeps things moving enough that it just about holds together, but especially the performances. That includes Sadie Sink in a role that I can't name, which is a ridiculous state of affairs, especially as she's gone on a press tour where she can't even talk about her part, but I can at least confirm that I thought she was brilliant, and I suspect we'll be seeing a lot more of her. It's also further proof of how perfectly cast Tom Holland was in the role, still keeping his likeable youthful energy, but he also gets to show the heartbreak and pain as more tragedy befalls him, and he keeps getting better with each passing film. He really benefits from a more down-to-earth approach to the character that is a welcome return to basics, even if it's also clear that, knowing the MCU, it probably isn't going to stay that way for long. If you like this review and you want to support my work, you can give me a tip on my Ko-fi page, or with YouTube's Super Thanks feature, which is right below the video. Or you can keep me around as your friendly neighbourhood film critic by joining my Patreon, where you can see my videos early among other perks, including access to my Discord server, and you can also join YouTube memberships for similar perks. Or you can just simply like, share and hype the video. Every little bit helps. Until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.